Morning. First of all, I want to thank everybody for being here, and let me start off with this. I just want to make sure that we ensure the community one thing, that we have a process in place here at St. Petersburg Police Department. We review every use of force report that is written by an officer. We have a process in place. It worked. In this case, it definitely worked. The supervisor saw something when they were reviewing the case. They sent it to the Officer Professional Standards. It was reviewed by the Officer Professional Standards. It was then sent to my level. Command staff looked at it, and yesterday afternoon, I terminated this officer from the St. Petersburg Police Department because we will not tolerate this type of behavior when we're arresting someone. So I will summarize the case, then I'll open up for any questions for you. So on 6/20/21, Officer Cavener and his partner went to arrest Mr. Timothy Grant. Mr. Grant had 5 active warrants for his arrest. The officer was called to the scene because the owner of the business wanted Mr. Grant trespassed from the store. When the officer checked Mr. Grant for warrant, he found there were 5 active warrants for Mr. Grant. While the officer was waiting for the warrants checks to come back, he did see Mr. Grant walking around the business, apparently panhandling from customers. When the officers went to make the arrest, Mr. Grant was sitting in a wheelchair. I have to say, in a wheelchair. So the officer and his backup then told Mr. Grant the reason why they were making the arrest. Once they told Mr. Grant why they were making the arrest, they then proceeded to try to handcuff Mr. Grant. What the officer did wrong, what we saw was, instead of using both of his hands, he went right to his taser and he started tasering Mr. Grant. We know for a fact that he tasered Mr. Grant 4 times. And when I say taser, he dry stunned Mr. Grant 4 times. And dry stunning means that he did not activate the prones. What he did was he placed the taser up against his body and he pulled the trigger, and that does cause an electrical shock to go through the body. After that was done, he wrote a report. In the report, he said that Mr. Grant was resisting with violence. You've all saw that tape. Mr. Grant was not resisting with violence. That charge has been reduced to resisting arrest without violence because Mr. Grant refused to put his hands behind his back. Mr. Grant is still in custody for the 5 active warrants that he's in prison now serving on those 5 active warrants. And I just want to make sure I reiterate this to everyone. We had a process in place. The command staff looked at this tape, looked at the report, saw what the officer did, and took it right to the Officer Professional Standard like they're supposed to be. This will not and cannot be tolerated here at St. Petersburg Police Department. And as long as I'm the chief here, it will not be tolerated. With that, I'll open it for any questions.
Chief, what was your reaction when you saw that video?
It's even hard to explain. I think I looked at a video over 20 times. And till today, I still cannot explain to you why that officer went to his taser. We train officers every year. Everybody in this police department has been trained on de-escalation. There was no de-escalation. He went right to his taser. No. They should have thought about the tactic. You have 2 officers there. If we can't control a subject like that, we have a problem.
Can you explain how the use of body cameras were important and critical for the review process and to know what really happened in a situation like this?
Well, it's very important. Like I said earlier, no matter before we got the body cameras, we had already had a policy in place that we review every use of force. The body camera just helped us see exactly what happened that day. So by the officers getting a chance, the supervisor getting a chance to go back and look at that, it really proved exactly what happened. And let me also, I didn't say this. Now, the victim didn't complain. The people at the scene didn't complain. It was the supervisor. So I want to commend my supervisors for seeing something wrong and taking care of it. Still today, Mr. Grant did not complain. We went and interviewed Mr. Grant at the jail to let him know that the officer did something wrong.
Can you talk about the value of transparency in a case like this? I mean, you guys are just getting out in front of it.
It's very important. We want the community to know that we have a process in place, and we want the community to know that we're going to deal with when we see some violation like this. I spoke to some of our community leaders this morning to let them know that the officer was terminated.
Could the officer be facing any criminal charges from this?
No, it cannot. There was really no intent. I believe that the officer just didn't know what to do, and he did the wrong thing. What will happen next now would be that he's been terminated, so his file now will be sent to the Department of FDLE, Florida Law Enforcement, and it'll be up to them if they're going to pull his certification. The officer does still have the right to grieve this and go through the process of trying to get his job back.
Can you talk about what the officer said, what his reasoning was behind this?
So when we interviewed the officer, also professional standards and command staff yesterday spoke to him. He said it was a stress level when he got there, that he had heard. One of the warrants was resisting arrest with violence. So I only can assume that then he was thinking that this Mr. Grant was going to fight with him, so he was posturing himself for that. Again, not thinking about de-escalation. And he wasn't trained in this. He's never been trained. He's been trained to de-escalate first. This should not be your first option. This isn't your first option. And that's what he did. He made this his first option.
I understand that the officer that was with him, the two that were on that call, were very junior in experience. Is there anything going forward that you guys are going to review, maybe putting people with more experienced officers, anything like that?
We can't pick which officers we put there. Also, the officer that was out there had a year and a half on. His backup officers, I'm not sure. But before the officers go through the academy, then they go through post-academy, then they go through our field training program. We just don't put an officer out there. It takes somewhere between 5 to 8 months before we put an officer out there on the street alone. And then during that period of time, they have another year. So we make sure we put the best product out there on the street, again, to make sure the community is safe and make sure that the officers are safe.
Did that officer have any priors before this, or was this the only instance?
He had no priors to this.
Is there gonna be any new training for these officers so that they don't end up using that as their first option? What's next?
And yeah, like I said, we've already put something in place 3 years ago. So we'll continue. We have open mat day. We have open self-defense day. So any officer that think they need to work on these skill set, they can go there anytime. So I think this department is way ahead in training, and we're going to continue. Did we learn something from that training? Yes, we did. Will we go back and show this videotape to the newer recruits? Yes, we will. Because again, that's not the first option. You need to talk to the person. We're taught how to use our hands and how to put someone in custody.
Does anything point to, since he's a white officer and this was a black male, does he have a history of having any kind of disrespect toward the black community?
No, not at all. Again, this was just one incident. He used the wrong type of force, and we corrected that right away. He's no longer here. Anything else? Thank you.
Thank you.
Do you mind holding up that taser again so I can grab a tighter shot of it?
And could you explain, so when he put that on his back, was it?
Yes.
Tell me, what is that versus putting it on his back versus the prongs? Can you kind of go through that?
Sure. So when Officer Cavanagh had this out, so again, Officer Cavanagh has been trained in this. So there's two ways you can do it. The prongs that, if I point it, I can make the prongs come out, or I can dry stun it. So that means I turn on this, and I just pull the trigger. So I'm going to take this, and I'm going to put it up against your body, and then I'm going to activate it, and that's what you saw. He did that. So you see the motion that I'm doing? 4 times, because you got to recycle it. So you have to turn it on, turn it off, turn it back on, and each time, that's what he's doing to Mr. Grant. No.